So right now, I'm going to start talking about factoring. So this is basically a review of stuff we did in Chapter 4 and stuff we already looked at in Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. So right now I'm going to do factoring of trinomials. So that means they have three terms. And what I'm going to show first is how to do it using a process called grouping. And in particular, I'm going to start out when the a value is not 1. And what I mean by a value, this is what I'm looking at. Any quadratic can be written as ax squared plus bx plus c. So that's a quadratic, and I want to factor that. So when I say a is not 1, it could be a fraction, it could be positive, it could be negative, it's just not the number 1. So let's go ahead and take a look at some examples. So for this first one, I'm going to start out with 7x squared minus 57x plus 8. Okay, so when I factor a trinomial by grouping, what I'm going to do is I'm going to find what multiplies a times c, that will also sum to get me b. So over here, let me make a little note that this is a, this is b, including the negative sign. So again, this whole trough is a, all of this is b, this is c. So over here, I'm going to do a times c. So a times c, 7 times 8, 7 times 8, and that gets me 56. I need to find two numbers that multiply to get me to positive 56, but sum to get me negative 57. And so when I do this, I would normally start low and work my way up. However, I noticed that using 7 and 8 to get this 56, well, 56 and 1 would get me 57. So here's really what I get to do. That breakdown is going to be negative 1 and negative 56. Here's why. When I multiply them together, negative 1 times negative 56 gets me positive 56. And when I add these up, I get negative 57, which was my goal. So overall, what you're trying to do, trying to find two things that multiply, so their product is AC, and they sum to get you B. I can make a little note of that up top here. So your goal, find two numbers that multiply to get AC and sum to get B. That is your goal when you are factoring these trinomials. So I'm going to take these two values and I'm going to replace them in the B position. Now, what I see as a common mistake is people just put the numbers in. These numbers are coefficients. They're still going to be attached to the x. So here's what I'm going to have. 7x squared. Let me keep the same color here. I'm then going to do minus 1x minus 56x plus 8. And in that way, you can see that negative 1x minus 56x is still negative 57x. I'm just finding a way to regroup it. From here, we're going to go ahead and factor the first two terms and the last two terms. And that's what the phrase means when it says by grouping. So I'm going to come through here. I'm going to go ahead and group them together. So I'm going to think about them grouped like this. And then think about them grouped over here. Now I have a minus sign here. Now here's a part where people tend to mix it up. They might put the parentheses in the wrong spot. I want you to be clear that the negative is attached to the 56, but in order for me to put the parentheses down, I've got to put a little plus sign. So I'm going to say I made it a plus sign, putting parentheses here, and notice that when I separated, I still see a negative. So basically, I just rewrote it to make it easier to tell. I'm using the idea that plus a negative is the same thing as minus a positive. If that doesn't make sense, it's okay. You don't have to use the parentheses. I'm only doing that so you can see what's happening. But here's what should not happen. You should not have parenthesis touching parenthesis. You must have a plus sign in the middle, otherwise it means multiplication. This is the only way for it to mean addition. What we're going to do now, we're going to look for the greatest common factor. What goes into both of these values? Well, x is the only thing. So over here, let me switch colors. I'm going to go ahead right now and factor out an x. So I'm going to take out an x. To find out what I'm left with, what you're essentially doing is coming from these first two terms and dividing by whatever it was that you factored out. Let me go ahead and put my parentheses back in place. So what I had left over, well, 7 is still here. X squared divided by x, that's just x. Minus x divided by x, that's minus 1. This plus sign drops straight down. Again, don't lose the plus sign. Looking at this stuff here, I have negative 56x plus 8. Because this first term is a negative and this first term is a positive, I'm going to go ahead and take out a negative. In fact, I'm going to take out a negative 8 because 8 goes into both numbers. I'm going to pull out negative 8, parentheses. Again, the question is, what am I left with? I'm going to come through here, divide that by negative 8, divide that by negative 8. Negative 56 divided by negative 8, that is positive 7, and I've still an x there, so 7x. 8 divided by negative 8 is minus 1. Now take a moment and see what we have here. X, 7x minus 1, plus a negative 8 times 7x minus 1. This is a good thing. Factoring by grouping only works if the stuff on the inside is the same. So we're now going to go ahead and factor that out. So think of this giant green chunk and this giant green chunk. I'm going to pull out the green chunks and see what's left. So if I take this stuff out, slide this up here, I now have 7x minus 1. Well, if I take that out, and again, when I say take it out, what I'm saying is that I'm coming from the beginning here, and I'm dividing these by 7x minus 1. What I am left with is x, and then I have plus a negative 8, but plus a negative is the same thing as saying subtraction. So I have x minus 8. And that's your final answer. So my end answer for this, in factored form, is 7x minus 1 times the quantity of x minus 8. Let's do the same thing for this question. I have 4p squared plus 19p plus 12. Notice that I have a, b, c. Okay, so I'm going to start by multiplying a times c. AC equals 4 times 12, which is 48. So that means that I need to find two numbers that multiply to get me 48, but sum to get me 19. Now looking at it, I might not have an idea, so I'm going to make a list of factors of 48. I'm going to start low and just work myself up. I have 1 and 48. That can't get me 19. I've got 2 and 24. That won't get me 19. I have 3 and 16, and I go, oh wait, that does work. Because if I add them together going straight across, I get 19. So that means that 3 and 16, these will be our coefficients. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this. Instead of 19, I'll be using 3 and 16. So I have 4p squared plus, and to make this a little bit nicer to factor, I'm going to put the 16 first because 4 and 16 go nicely together and 3 and 12 go nicely together. Even if you did it the other way, it would still work. It just might be a little bit more annoying. So plus 16p plus 3p, and then back to the plus 12. So again, notice that 3 and 16 are the coefficients because they still get me back to 19p. I'm not changing anything, or I'm not changing the values. I'm simply reordering how they're being grouped. When I add them together, they'll still be the same thing. So now I'm going to go ahead and factor by grouping. I'm going to look at the first two and look at the last two. You can choose to put parentheses in or not, as always. I'm still going to put them in so you can see what I'm looking at. So I'm looking at this here, and I'm looking at that there. Again, notice I do have a plus sign in the middle because they must stay separated. So for these first two things here, I notice that they both have a 4p in common. 4p. So I'm going to come from these first two, and I'm going to divide them by that 4p. So again, the greatest common factor is the largest number or variable that goes into both parts. 4 divided by 4, it's gone now. P squared divided by p, that's p. 16 divided by 4, that's 4. P divided by p, that's gone. So that's my first set. Do the same thing over here. I notice, drop my plus sign down, they both have a 3 in common. So take out a 3, which means coming from here, I am dividing these by 3. Put down your parentheses. 3p divided by 3 is just p. 12 divided by 3 is 4. Okay? So now, as before, I'm going to come through here and factor out this stuff. Again, this stuff here is the same in both. So I'm going to have p plus 4 as one set of parentheses, and the other set is the stuff that was remaining. 4p plus 3. If you'd like, you can still show it as fully dividing this by p plus 4 and dividing that by p plus 4, but it's not necessary. I took out the chunks. The stuff that's left were the things in the front. 4p plus 3. So here we go. This one is now in factored form. And again, this is another example of using factoring by grouping, because I had to group stuff together. It was a trinomial, 3 terms, and my first term, my a value, was not 1. Let me go ahead and do one more. Slide this up. For this next one, I'm going to have 25 x squared plus 20x minus 32. And as before, A, B, and C. So I'm going to go ahead and say, all right, let's find A times C. So 25 times negative 32. And I'm going to go ahead and grab a calculator here. So 25 times negative 32, negative 800. Not so bad. That'll actually be okay to deal with. Got negative 800. And so that's our product of AC. Our goal is to also find those numbers that sum to get us B, just 20. Well, the nice thing about 800 is that it's pretty easy to work with. Notice here, so I have to use a negative. I see this negative sign here. So one answer is going to be negative, one's going to be positive. Notice that if I use positive 40 and negative 20, well, that's my negative. 4 times 2 is 8. 10 times 10 is 100. So that's 800. And when I add them, 40 minus 20, I get 20. That's going to be my winner. So these will be the coefficients of B. 25 x squared. And I'm going to group this as, actually doesn't matter, plus 40x minus 20x minus 32. Oh, to be consistent, let me go over this in black. Minus 32. There we go. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and factor by grouping. And this time, I'm not going to bother showing the parentheses. Again, that's an optional step. But I will do it as first two terms last two terms. That's the rule when factoring by grouping. So looking at these two things, they both have 5x in common. So I'm going to go ahead and take out 5x, which means come through here, divide by 5x, and write down what you're left with. Well, 25 divided by 5 is just 5. X squared over x is x. 40 divided by 5 is 8. X divided by x is just 1. There's nothing there. So 5x plus 8 is on my inside. For this next set, I have negative 20x and negative 32. They both have a negative, so I know I want to take out a negative. 20 is 4 times 5. 32 is 4 times 8. Take out a 4. Which means I'm coming through here and dividing both by negative 4. And let's write what's left. Now again, if I did this correctly, this inside and that inside will match. If they don't match, it means you cannot solve it using purely factoring. Probably need rational root theorem, which we later did in near the end of chapter 4, I think was section 4.6. So what I have here is negative 20 divided by negative 4. That's 5x, because that x is still there. Negative over negative is now positive, and 32 divided by 4 is 8. So we're good so far. And notice that 5x plus 8 and 5x plus 8. So when we group these together now, we have 5x plus 8 coming from those insides, and then we have the outside stuff, 5x minus 4. So that's how you factor by grouping. From the step, if this was the equation of a quadratic, you could find the x-intercepts by setting them equal to 0. But for this particular lesson, I'm only reminding you guys how to do the factoring part. The review on the x-intercepts will come later. So again, this one was for how to factor trinomials using factoring by grouping when a is not 1.